Let me give you one number: 32. That is how old Alexander the Great was when he died. By that age, most people are still figuring out their career, arguing about rent, and wondering if they should finally go to the gym. Alexander had already conquered Egypt, Persia, Afghanistan, and most of modern-day India. He had built an empire stretching 3,000 miles from Greece to the edge of the known world. He had fought in hundreds of battles and won every single one of them. Not most of them. Every single one in human history. Across thousands of years of warfare, there have been great generals, brilliant tacticians, lucky commanders, and ruthless conquerors. Almost all of them lost at least once. Alexander the Great went his entire military career, from his first major battle at 18 years old to his last campaign in India at 30, without a single defeat. Zero. And here is the part that actually breaks your brain. He wasn't just winning because he had a bigger army. Half the time, he didn't. At the Battle of Gaugamela, the battle that effectively ended the Persian Empire, Alexander led roughly 47,000 men against a Persian force that ancient sources put at anywhere between 250,000 and 1,000,000 soldiers. Modern historians think the real number was probably around 100,000 to 150,000. He won anyway, in a single afternoon. This is the story of Alexander the Great, the most successful military commander in human history. The man who conquered the known world by 30, cried because there was nothing left to conquer, and was dead 2 years later under circumstances that nobody has fully explained in 2,300 years. But before we get into the battles, the tears, and the deeply suspicious death, welcome to Sketchy Past. If you like history served fast, loud, and without the boring parts, subscribe right now and join the Sketchy Empire. Ring that bell. We're building something here. And Alexander would tell you that showing up before everyone else is literally how you win. He proved it about 200 times. Let's go. To understand Alexander, you have to understand the two people who made him. And they were both, in their own completely different ways, absolutely terrifying. His father was Philip II of Macedon, one of the most underrated military and political geniuses of the ancient world. When Philip inherited Macedonia in 359 BC, it was a minor, semi-barbaric kingdom on the northern edge of the Greek world that its neighbors didn't take seriously. The Athenians called Macedonians semi-civilized. The established Greek city-states, Athens, Sparta, Thebes, viewed Macedonia roughly the way a major league team views a farm club. Philip spent 20 years systematically proving every single one of them wrong. He reformed the Macedonian army from the ground up, inventing, or massively refining, the sarissa phalanx, infantry units armed with pikes up to 21 feet long, arranged in tight formations that created an impenetrable wall of spear points that enemies literally could not get through from the front. He combined this infantry corps with heavy cavalry on the flanks, creating a combined arms fighting force that was more flexible and more lethal than anything Greece had produced before. Then he used that army, plus an extraordinary talent for diplomacy, bribery, and strategic marriage, to bring most of Greece under Macedonian control. By the time Alexander was born, Philip had transformed Macedonia from a backwater kingdom into the dominant power in the Greek world. Alexander's mother was Olympias, a princess from Epirus, one of Philip's several wives, and a woman who was, depending on which ancient source you read, either a deeply spiritual devotee of mystery cults or completely unhinged, or possibly both. She kept snakes as religious companions, which her husband Philip apparently found unsettling, which is saying something given that Philip spent his career around soldiers and warfare. Olympias was ferociously devoted to Alexander and consistently told him two things. First, that he was destined for greatness beyond any ordinary king, and second, that his real father wasn't Philip at all, that he was the son of Zeus, king of the gods. Alexander appears to have genuinely believed this, or at least found it extremely useful, for his entire life. Philip, to his credit, took his son's education seriously enough to hire the greatest intellectual of the ancient world as Alexander's personal tutor, Aristotle. From the ages of roughly 13 to 16, Alexander was educated by the man who basically invented biology, physics, political science, logic, ethics, and literary criticism. Aristotle apparently gave Alexander an annotated copy of the Iliad. Homer's epic about the Trojan War, and Alexander kept it with him on every campaign, sleeping with it under his pillow next to a dagger. His childhood hero was Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Trojan War, who chose a short, glorious life over a long, obscure one. Alexander was not subtle about this identification. He modeled his self-presentation, his behavior in battle, and his understanding of his own destiny explicitly on Achilles. This is important context. Alexander wasn't just a military genius operating on cold strategic logic. He was a man who genuinely believed he was the son of a god, who had been educated by the greatest philosopher alive, who modeled himself on a mythological hero, and who had been told since childhood that his destiny was to surpass every human being who had ever lived. That combination of absolute self-belief, extraordinary education, and world-class military training is either the recipe for the greatest conqueror in history or a complete psychological disaster. In Alexander's case, it was both, sequentially. Philip II was assassinated in 336 BC, stabbed at his own daughter's wedding by a bodyguard, under circumstances that ancient sources found suspicious, and that modern historians still argue about. Olympias was accused. Alexander was accused. The actual truth died with Philip. Alexander was 20 years old. He immediately moved with characteristic speed to eliminate every potential rival to the throne. Half-brothers, cousins, political enemies, anyone who might use the chaos of a succession to make a play for power. This was standard ancient practice, not personal sadism, but Alexander executed it with a thoroughness and efficiency that made clear exactly what kind of ruler he was going to be. Then, before anyone had time to think he might be a soft target, he marched north to deal with rebellious tribes on Macedonia's borders, crushed them, marched back, discovered that the Greek city of Thebes had revolted against Macedonian authority during his absence, marched south, and destroyed Thebes so completely, killing 6,000 people and selling 30,000 into slavery, that the ruins served as a message to every other Greek city about the cost of rebellion. He was 20 years old. With Greece secured and Macedonia stable, Alexander turned to the project his father had been planning before his death, the invasion of Persia. The Persian Empire in 334 BC was the largest empire in the world. It stretched from modern-day Turkey and Egypt in the west to the borders of India in the east, encompassing dozens of nations, hundreds of cities, and a population of somewhere between 17 and 35 million people, roughly half the world's known population at the time. Its king, Darius III, commanded resources and manpower that dwarfed anything Alexander could field. Alexander crossed into Persian-controlled territory in 334 BC with approximately 37,000 soldiers and essentially no money. Ancient sources say he had supplies for about 30 days and was personally in debt. His plan, to the extent that invade the largest empire in the world, with 30 days of supplies counts as a plan, was to win fast, live off the conquered territory, and keep moving before anyone could organize an effective response. The Battle of the Granicus River, 334 BC. The first major engagement was at the Granicus River in western Turkey. Persian forces, local satraps with Greek mercenary support, positioned themselves on the opposite bank to block the crossing. Alexander's generals advised caution. Wait until dawn, let the men rest, assess the position properly. Alexander crossed immediately, leading from the front in a way that his generals found alarming and his enemies found terrifying. He was nearly killed. A Persian cavalryman struck him in the head with an axe and cracked his helmet. Another Persian was about to deliver a killing blow from behind when one of Alexander's companions, Clytus the Black, cut the man's arm off. The Macedonians won. The road into Persia was open. The Battle of Issus, 333 BC. Darius III himself took the field at Issus in southern Turkey, commanding a Persian army that vastly outnumbered Alexander's forces. Ancient sources give numbers as high as 600,000 for the Persians. Modern historians estimate somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000, still roughly double Alexander's strength. The battle was fought in a narrow coastal plain between mountains and sea, terrain that neutralized the Persian numerical advantage because there simply wasn't enough room to deploy a vastly larger army effectively. Alexander attacked directly at Darius's position, leading his companion cavalry in a charge that broke through the Persian left flank and drove straight toward the Persian king. Darius fled. His army, seeing their king abandon the field, collapsed. Alexander captured Darius's entire family, his mother, wife, daughters, and son, who had accompanied the Persian army. He treated them with complete courtesy, housed them in royal comfort, and reportedly told Darius's mother that he was not replacing Darius as king. He was the king now, and she was under his personal protection. This was not just kindness. It was a political statement of extraordinary sophistication. I am not a barbarian conqueror. I am the legitimate successor to the Persian throne. Egypt, 332 to 331 BC after Isis. Alexander moved south along the Mediterranean coast, systematically taking Persian-controlled cities and cutting the Persian navy off from its ports. The siege of Tyre, an island city that had never been taken, took 7 months. Alexander built a causeway from the mainland to the island and took it by direct assault. The causeway still exists. The modern city of Tyre is built on it. He then marched into Egypt, which surrendered without significant resistance. The Egyptians, who had been under Persian rule and resented it, welcomed him as a liberator. The priests of the temple at Memphis declared him the son of Amun, the Egyptian equivalent of Zeus. Alexander, who had already been told his whole life he was the son of Zeus, found this confirmation extremely satisfying. He founded Alexandria in Egypt, one of more than 20 cities he would name after himself, which became, within a century of its founding, the intellectual capital of the ancient world. The Library of Alexandria, the greatest repository of knowledge in antiquity, was built there. He was 24 years old. With Egypt secured, Alexander turned east toward the heart of the Persian Empire. Darius, having regrouped after the disaster at Issus, had assembled the largest army he could field and chosen his ground carefully, a wide, flat plain near the village of Gaugamela in modern-day Iraq, terrain specifically selected to give his numerically superior forces room to deploy fully and use their numbers effectively. Darius also had a new weapon, scythed chariots, war chariots with blades attached to the wheel axles, designed to cut through infantry formations. He had reportedly had the ground specially leveled to allow these chariots to operate at maximum effectiveness. Ancient sources give the Persian force at Gaugamela as anywhere from 250,000 to 1,000,000 men. Modern historians' best estimates put it at somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000, against Alexander's 47,000. The night before the battle, Alexander's general Parmenion suggested a night attack, hit the Persians in the darkness before they could organize. Alexander reportedly refused, saying he would not steal a victory. Whether this was genuine chivalric pride, or a calculated understanding that a night attack with a smaller force against a larger one in unfamiliar terrain was actually more dangerous than it sounded, is debated. It sounds like Alexander. It also sounds like the kind of thing someone says when they're planning something the other person hasn't figured out yet. The battle began with the Persian scythed chariots charging the Macedonian line. Alexander had prepared for this. His infantry opened lanes in their formation, let the chariots through, and killed the drivers from the sides as they passed. The terrifying new weapon was neutralized in minutes. Then Alexander executed the move that won the battle. He led his companion cavalry on the right flank, riding obliquely, not straight at the enemy, but at an angle, drawing the Persian left flank to follow him, which created a gap in the Persian line. Alexander turned, drove straight through the gap with his cavalry, and headed directly for Darius. Darius fled. Again, the Persian center, seeing their king retreat, began to collapse. The battle turned into a pursuit. The Persian Empire, the greatest political entity in the world for 2 centuries, effectively ceased to exist in a single afternoon. Alexander was 25 years old. He walked into Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, one of the most magnificent cities in the ancient world, and took the Persian royal treasury. Ancient sources record the amount as somewhere around 120,000 talents of silver. To give you a sense of scale, the entire annual revenue of the Athenian Empire at its height was about 1,000 talents per year. Alexander had just captured 120 times that in a single treasury. He then burned Persepolis. The reasons for this are debated. Some ancient sources say it was deliberate, revenge for the Persian burning of Athens 150 years earlier. Some say it was an accident, the result of a drunken party. Some say it was both a deliberate decision made during a drunken party. Alexander himself apparently expressed regret about it afterward. The symbolic message, accidental or not, was clear. The old order was gone. A new one was beginning. After Gaugamela and the fall of Persepolis, the logical move, the strategically sound, politically reasonable, historically precedented move, would have been to stop, consolidate, govern, build institutions for the enormous territory already conquered. Alexander did not stop. He chased Darius across Persia, only to find that Darius had been murdered by his own satrap, Bessus, before Alexander could reach him. Alexander reportedly wept when he found Darius's body, gave him a royal funeral, declared that the man who had killed his enemy was a criminal rather than an ally, and hunted Bessus down. Then he kept going east, through modern-day Afghanistan, which was, then as now, extraordinarily difficult terrain that broke armies, and into Central Asia, where he fought a grinding guerrilla war against local resistance for 3 years. This was the hardest fighting of his career. Not pitched battles where his tactical genius could shine, but ambushes, hit, and run raids, insurgency warfare in mountains and deserts against enemies who refused to stand and fight. He pushed through it. He founded cities. He married Roxana, a Bactrian princess, a political and apparently also personal decision that his Macedonian officers found extremely controversial. They had followed him from Macedonia, expecting Persian gold. They had not signed up to watch their king adopt Persian customs, wear Persian dress, demand that they perform proskynesis, the Persian gesture of prostration before the king, and marry foreign women. The tension between Alexander and his Macedonian officers was building throughout the Central Asian campaigns, and it broke into open violence more than once. He killed Clitus the Black, the same man who had saved his life at the Granicus, during a drunken argument in which Clitus criticized Alexander's adoption of Persian ways and his dismissal of his father Philip's achievements. Alexander grabbed a spear from a guard and killed him on the spot. He was reportedly devastated by remorse afterward. He did not undo it. In 327 BC, Alexander crossed the Hindu Kush mountains into the Indian subcontinent. He defeated King Porus at the Battle of the Hydaspes River in modern-day Pakistan, one of his most tactically difficult victories, fought in monsoon conditions against Indian war elephants. He reportedly admired Porus so much after the battle that he restored him as a client king. Then he pushed further east, and further, until his army stopped. At the Hyphasis River in Punjab, the furthest east Alexander would ever reach, his soldiers refused to go on, not a mutiny exactly. They didn't attack their officers or desert. They simply sat down, and when Alexander called them to assembly and gave one of his legendary speeches about glory and conquest and destiny, they were silent. His general Coenus spoke for the army. The men wanted to go home. They had been marching and fighting for 8 years. They had crossed mountains and deserts and rivers and jungles. They had won every battle. They had enough. They wanted to see their families. Alexander retreated to his tent for 3 days. Ancient sources say he was hoping the army would change its mind. They didn't. He agreed to turn back. He reportedly wept, not from sadness exactly, but because there were still lands to the east he would never see, enemies he would never face, glories he would never achieve. The world had run out before his ambition did. He was 30 years old. The return journey from India was brutal in a way that none of Alexander's campaigns had been, not because of enemies, but because of terrain and logistics. He chose to march part of his army back through the Gadrosian desert in modern-day Pakistan and Iran. Why he made this choice is not entirely clear. Ancient sources suggest he was trying to outdo previous conquerors who had attempted and failed the same crossing. Whatever the reason, the desert crossing killed enormous numbers of soldiers, camp followers, and animals through heat, thirst, and starvation. Some ancient sources claim he lost more men in the Gadrosian desert than in all his battles combined. He reached Babylon in 323 BC and began making plans. Not retirement plans, conquest plans. He was preparing campaigns against Arabia, against Carthage, possibly against Rome. He was reorganizing the empire, integrating Persian nobles into his administration, training mixed Macedonian Persian units. And then, in the 3rd of June 23 BC, after several days of heavy drinking at a party, Alexander fell ill. He developed a fever. He was unable to walk within a few days. His officers and soldiers, hearing he was dying, reportedly filed past his bed for a final farewell. He was too weak to speak, but acknowledged each one with his eyes or a slight movement of his hand. On the 10th of June or 323 BC, Alexander the Great died. He was 32 years old. His last coherent words, when asked who should inherit his empire, were reportedly, "to the strongest," or possibly to Craterus, or possibly to the best. The ancient sources disagree, which is itself suspicious. The cause of death has been debated for 2,300 years and has never been definitively resolved. The leading candidates, typhoid fever complicated by other infections, the most widely accepted medical explanation, consistent with the symptoms described. Poisoning, suspected at the time, particularly involving Antipater, the regent Alexander had left in charge of Macedonia, whose son Iolaus was Alexander's wine pourer. Ancient sources took this seriously. Modern historians are divided. Excessive alcohol consumption. Alexander drank heavily throughout his life, increasingly so in his later years. His liver may simply have given out. West Nile virus. A 2019 paper proposed this based on the symptom record and the observation that ancient sources mention birds dying in Babylon around the same time, which is consistent with a West Nile outbreak. Nobody knows. The greatest conqueror in human history died in circumstances that remain genuinely mysterious, in a city that was not his home, at an age when most people are just getting started. After his death, his generals, the Diadochi, the successors, spent 40 years fighting each other over the pieces of his empire. None of them came close to reassembling what he had built. The empire fragmented into successor kingdoms that shaped the history of the Mediterranean and Middle East for centuries. His body was eventually placed in a golden sarcophagus in Alexandria. Its current location is unknown. The tomb of Alexander the Great, like the tomb of Genghis Khan, has never been found. Alexander the Great left behind a complicated, contradictory, genuinely extraordinary legacy that 2,300 years of scholarship has not fully resolved. He spread Greek language, culture, and ideas across an enormous swath of the ancient world. The period after his death is called the Hellenistic Age, specifically because of the way his conquests spread Greek civilization into Egypt, Persia, Central Asia, and beyond. The Koine Greek that developed from his empire became the shared language of the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries. It is the language the New Testament was written in. He founded cities, at least 20 of them, including Alexandria in Egypt, that became major centers of trade, culture, and intellectual life. The Library of Alexandria, the Lighthouse of Alexandria, the intellectual ferment that produced figures like Euclid and Archimedes. All of this is, in a meaningful sense, downstream of Alexander's conquests. He was also, by any honest assessment, responsible for enormous suffering. The sieges, the mass killings, the destruction of cities, the hundreds of thousands of deaths in his campaigns. These were real human costs paid by real people who had not chosen to be in the path of one man's ambition. He was personally courageous to a degree that bordered on reckless. He fought in the front lines of every major battle, was wounded multiple times, and seems to have had a genuine inability to ask his soldiers to do anything he was unwilling to do himself. He was also capable of extreme cruelty. The destruction of Thebes, the burning of Persepolis, the killing of Clytus. He was brilliant and he was damaged, and the two things were probably related. A childhood that told you constantly that you were destined for divine greatness, that you were the son of a god, that your purpose was to surpass every human being who had ever lived. That kind of upbringing doesn't produce well-adjusted, emotionally stable adults. It produces people who need to conquer the world to feel like themselves. Julius Caesar, standing in front of a statue of Alexander in Spain, reportedly wept because at the age when Caesar was still a minor political figure, Alexander had already conquered the world. Napoleon studied Alexander obsessively, So did Patton. So did every serious military mind for 2,000 years after his death. Because the tactical and operational lessons of his campaigns remain relevant in ways that most ancient history simply doesn't. He was the greatest military commander who ever lived. He was a deeply flawed human being. He changed the world in ways that reverberate to the present day. He was dead at 32. Whatever you were doing at 32, it probably wasn't that. That was Alexander the Great. The man who never lost a battle conquered the known world by 30, cried because there was nothing left to conquer, and was dead 2 years later, under circumstances that nobody has explained in over 2,000 years. If this video hit you differently than you expected, if you came in thinking you knew the story and left realizing you only knew the surface, then like this video right now, because that is exactly what Sketchy Past is built to do. Subscribe if you haven't already, ring the bell, we're 4 videos in and we're just getting warmed up. Next episode, Attila the Hun. The man who made Roman emperors beg, called himself the Scourge of God, and turned the most powerful empire in the Western world into a protection racket. If Alexander was the greatest general who ever lived, Attila was the guy who proved that sometimes the best strategy is just being so terrifying that your enemies pay you to go away. Stay sketchy. See you in the next one.